Greetings all, Chieftain here. It is time for an overview of all the various vehicles that were being used, at least the armoured ones, in the oncoming invasion of France. As per some of the previous videos, you will forgive me for not yet having a teleprompter. I shall be referring to my strategically placed monitor off to the left. Now, I tend to have rather a strong dislike for vehicle comparisons, as if tanks were designed and operated in a vacuum. They meet each other on the field of honor, dueling. Well, instead, tanks are usually used as a subset of a much larger force, much as artillery would be, or air, or obstacles. A tank is designed to meet a set of criteria. And these criteria are inherently subjective. What is important to one designer or one doctrinaire need not necessarily be just as important to another. And neither of them need necessarily be wrong. It's all dependent on the situation that the designing nation finds itself. Now, I already have the 3 videos out covering the doctrine and the development of the doctrine of the 3 major powers that we're about to discuss. And if you haven't seen them yet, hop on over and check them out. You'll find them, go back to the World War II channel homepage on YouTube, look for the playlist called Hardware, and you'll find the links to the 3 of them there. And I'll see you back here in about 2.5 to 3 hours. Otherwise, let us go on. Now, the other issue, as I've alluded to in the past, is that there's far more to a tank than just having a big gun and armor. I mean, if there was, then the Germans wouldn't be making both Panzer IVs and a Tiger at the same time. In modern American parlance, you expect a tank in battle to be able to shoot, move, and communicate. I'm told, it's popped up in a YouTube comment, I think, that the Germans today actually shoot, communicate, move, and then shoot. But whatever. The same general gist. A tank needs to be where it is going to have the right effect at the right time, and it needs to be able to coordinate its actions. A tank is a system, not a weapon, and the measure of effectiveness is not armor thickness, maximum speed, sight magnification, or anything else like that. These are all means to an end. The end is still on target. You got to be in the right place at the right time with the right equipment to do the job. As Ralph Roths, the Panzer Museum director, observed in one of my interviews with him, the Germans won all their greatest victories in World War II with the smaller, less powerful tanks, and all their great losses when they had the biggest, meanest things on the battlefield. A possible exception, maybe the ISs. So this video is not simply going to be rehashing the armor specifications of the penetration tables, which you can easily find on Google with a search. I mean, if you're absolutely desperate to know the penetration value for Panzergranate 40 37mm round, go look it up, instead of listening to me ramble off figures, which will be very boring and you'll forget them all anyway. And besides, I would also observe that whatever the paper specifications say about values, real life tends not to care. Neither do the soft and squishy things inside the tank, which are just as susceptible to psychology and significant emotional events as your typical rifleman. Now, neither is this going to be an in-depth assessment of the various vehicles. There's a lot of them to cover. And if you want to really watch or listen to me spend half an hour to 45 minutes going over a single tank, I have plenty of such videos over on my channel. I'll mention the ones relevant to this video as I hit them. So that sets the parameters for the video, and now to the campaign. And since the Germans have elected to serve, let's start with them. Now, the Germans learned a few lessons after their experience with Poland, and one of which was that the tank units were too tank heavy. And this was a common failing of pretty much all the tank using nations, but because the Germans had the first practical experience, they also were the first to change it and fix it. The realization struck that even tank units needed a lot of infantry. And if you were fortunate enough to be a Panzer Grenadier who actually got to ride in an APC instead of a truck, the chances were that the APC in question was going to be an SDKFZ 250 or 251. The former looks pretty much a lot like the latter, it's just a bit smaller, and was used for transporting smaller sections or command elements, that sort of thing, observation posts for artillery. The infantry units tended to use the 251s. Now, German half-tracks have always struck me as being a little bit of an odd duck. They were very complicated machines and had a lot of liabilities to go with various positives. Now, the Germans are certainly not the first to try out the half-track idea. The British and the French had been doing it for quite some time, at least a decade earlier, and that's where the Germans got the idea. So one of their observers that was going around to different countries saw the French Congress and decided it was worth a look. And for whatever reason, though, the Germans were the only ones to take up the half-track mantle. The British and the French decided to go for full-track solutions. In the end, the only significant other half-track player was the United States, and their philosophy for half-track design was actually somewhat different to the German ones. It is probably best to describe a German half-track as a full-track vehicle with an auxiliary steering capability. The wheels provided for some shallow steering without losing any power or speed, making the vehicles very quick and efficient, especially on highways and road movements. When you needed to do a sharper turn, the track system would kick in with the steering just as it would on a regular tank. So these were not simple vehicles, and if I recall my conversation with Hilary Dorr correctly, the director or the manager of the factory that was producing SDKFZ8s said that for every 3 of those that he was making, he could make 5 Panthers. They also had what I can only conclude was a rather irritating design flaw. The tracks were lubricated, they were wet tracks, meaning that every single track link, now go look at a photo of it, has a bolt that you gotta open up when the track is in the right position to do it, when the link is in the right position, and then you got to fill it with lubricant on occasion. And I can only imagine how enamored the troops would have been of such a requirement. On the plus side, though, the half-tracks that the Germans had did provide excellent protection for the weight. The German alloys of the time were somewhat superior to those of their opponents, and the armor plates were also very well sloped. At least that's the design. I mean, in practice, I'm not entirely sure what it is that a 251 would stop, but let's say a Lorraine would not stop. I don't find it very likely that a 251 would stop a 25mm anti-tank round from the French anti-tank gun, for example, or maybe even a Boy's .55. But the half-track did mean that the German infantry could keep up with the tanks and fight alongside them in the front line. And I'll bet you thought I was just going to talk about the tanks. As I said, there's more to the battlefield than just tanks, and especially in World War II, the rifleman is arguably more important. Also important, and often overlooked and unloved, the eyes of the German army, the Spähwagens. Now, the primary scout car of the Panzerspäh companies was a variant of the 221. It's a 4x4. It was designed from the ground up as the German army's first purpose-designed armored car, instead of earlier conversions, basically, of civilian chassis. These things had four-wheel drive, four-wheel steering, and were capable of 80 kilometers an hour. A company was authorized 10 of these 221s. They're two-man vehicles and they're armed with a machine gun. A company would also have 4 222s, which has a 20mm and a machine gun, provide a little bit of heavier firepower. This was the vehicle made famous as Lieutenant Gruber's little tank. If you're old enough, you know exactly what I'm talking about. The turrets on both vehicles, well, okay, technically the 221 wasn't a turret, it was more of a 360-degree rotating shield, but same general idea, is open top. You often see it maybe with the cage on the top. So it allowed for good vision for the crew and also allowed for a very high angle of elevation in the event that some wandering airplane overhead needed to be deterred. Encouraged to go that away. By 1940, some improvements to the original design had been made, such as increasing the frontal armor to 14.5mm. They changed the weapons to more modern designs of the same caliber. An improvement which had not been incorporated by 1940, however, was the radio. There wasn't one, which begs the obvious question. It's all very well finding the enemy, but the whole point of the exercise is to tell the commanders where the enemy is. Enter thus the SDKFZ 223. Again, 4 per company, and this is the radio car. This basically is a reconfigured 221 to make room for a third man who is the radio operator. So, by use of hand or flag signals, the scout cars could relay information to the radio car, which would then relay up the line. And presumably for more detailed reporting, they'd park somewhere and the commander of one car would walk over and get on the radio direct. The heavier punch of the recon companies, such as it was provided by the 6 heavy armoured cars. And usually they were 3 231s and 3 232s. In early 1940, most of these were the 6 RADs, 6-wheeled vehicles, which had very limited off-road mobility, but a couple dozen of the new 8 RADs had entered service. By May 1940, these were still designated as the 233 and 234 armoured cars, but as an example of the practical interchangeability, the 8-wheelers were redesignated as 231 and 232 as well, with 6 RAD or 6 RAD or 8 RAD in brackets afterwards. And unit reporting often did not differentiate. They had a 231, 23, 232, and you had to somehow find out by other sources exactly what kind of vehicle that was. And Hilary Doyle finds that very irritating. In fact, a lot of the reporting is just unser Wagen, our vehicles. You got to know. The 234 designation would come back again as a designation in late 1940, but that is after the period that we're talking about here. Now, again, these vehicles are armed with a 2cm and a machine gun, and they did not come with radios. Only the 232s had those. The off-road mobility, even of the 8-wheel vehicles, was such that the recon troops requested full tracked. But for now, it was decided that the 80 kilometers an hour which they were capable of doing on roads was worth the loss of off-road capability. And so we come to the tanks. Yay! The Germans used about 2,500 tanks in the invasion of France, of a pretty whopping 6 types, which must have made the logisticians kind of mad. Of course, that wasn't the main intent. The goal was Panzer II, 3, and 4. But production was simply not up to demand. And although the numbers of the older Panzer Is and IIs were decreasing in proportion to what they were compared to the Polish invasion, they just weren't there yet. It is to my great annoyance that the Panzer I video is still stuck in editing hell over at Wargaming, so I don't have one to show you. I can say though that for what it is an extremely well designed and comfortable vehicle. And although you may scoff at the fact that it can't kill anything heavier than an armoured car, and even then only at close range, if you're an infantryman, the Panzer I is still quite scary. It is also worth observing that a 20mm was considered originally for the Panzer I before they went for the twin machine gun, so that should perhaps put the expectation of use into perspective. A total of about 500 Panzer Is were on strength, making them about 20% of the tank force. The vehicle was developed off a British Cardin Lloyd, which the Germans purchased by use of a couple of shell companies, and then modified to become a tank by reconfiguring the powertrain to make room for the turret. And then you have various other improvements, so the suspension actually looks somewhat different. By 1940, the Germans had still not yet changed their emphasis on mobility and radius of action as the priority over everything else, with armor being at the bottom of the list. And for the limits of what the Germans were able to create at the time in the early 30s, the Panzer I was very good with its welded hull. It was fast, it was reliable, it didn't take very long to construct a bridge capable of carrying it, and this is important when you consider all the waterways that are in northwest Europe. All the vehicles had radio receivers, although not all had transmission capability. That generally was limited just to the platoon leaders. Still, these radios created a huge increase in effectiveness of a tank unit. So there were 2 main designs of Panzer I. The A had the trailing idler and the B had the raised idler with the more powerful engine. They would be used in the light tank companies in place of Panzer IIs, which were supposed to be there. A lot of the Panzer IIs were being used in place of Panzer IIIs in the light tank companies because there weren't enough Panzer IIIs to fill up all the required slots. And if you think about the Panzer II as basically an expanded Panzer I with a little bit more HE capability and the ability to reliably destroy light armor, you won't be too far off. It retains the problem of the one-man turret, although at least the TC can just stick his head out the top if he has to. Part of the expansion of the vehicle was room for the third crewman, who was the radio man, and he sits actually facing officially to the rear on the left-hand side of the vehicle. Although, that said, the seat is actually reversible, so the radio operator could face forward, and in such a position, presumably, he could also help out with some of the loading functions of the turret. There were over 900 of these Panzer IIs in the French campaign, making them somewhere just over a third of the German tank force. Panzer I and II together made over half of the force. So, at first one may wonder how vehicles with their lighter armor and the one-man turrets can be compared to the French vehicles with their heavier armor and one-man turrets. Well, first, they were better coordinated, as radios, even if just receive only, are standard. Secondly, there is a French one-man turret and a German one-man turret, and the difference from inside is night and day. Trust me. Don't get me wrong, a one-man turret is still a significant problem in terms of combat, but at least the German ones take into account some reality of the fact that there's a bloke inside that needs to have general operating room and the ability to see outside. And as I said, even the diminutive little Panzer I is still quite comfortable. The crews are going to remain very fresh and alert for far longer than their opponents in their French counterpart vehicles. And of course, being fast and mobile and with radios, these vehicles could react very quickly, show up where they're not expected, and they were able to take rapid advantage of any opportunities that happened to show up. Plus, they were also usually fast enough to be able to get out of trouble if they got into it. The supposed main tank of the German army is the Panzer III, and I do have a video of that, although it is a later version with a 5cm gun. For the invasion of France, that vehicle was still under development because funding for the development of the gun was not approved until 1938, and it just hadn't entered service yet. But the tank was designed to be upgradable. A discussion on tank design by WW2, the tank development arm, shall we say, of the Department of Munitions, made note of a couple of things even today often overlooked. For example, it observed that cross-country speed is limited not so much by engine power as it is by vision. The vehicles have to travel slowly enough that a crew can be confident of going cross-country and seeing obstacles before they fall into them, which also incidentally is why M18 units, the Hellcats, never quite made any particular mention of the tactical utility of the high speed of their vehicle because, well, ditches show up much faster. The big question that the designers had for the Panzer III was weight. Most bridging units of the German army had an 8-ton or an 18-ton capacity, and the WW6 decided that, well, if you got to hold yourself to an 18-ton limit, armor thickness is less important than the tonnage required by the volume for speed, fuel, and the ability to divide combat tasks amongst the crew. That said, the French automatic 25mm anti-tank gun was considered a very serious threat, so there was little choice but to armor the tank to at least meet that. As a result, the Panzer IIIs, as seen in France, came in at a combat weight of about 19.5 tons combat loaded, and this stretched the ability of the 18-ton bridges to hold the weight. But you could still do it, kind of like circle exit, and you can save a quarter ton by getting 4 of the 5 crewmen to get out and walk. The result, though, out of all this was what I pretty much consider to be the best overall tank in the world in 1940. It was fast, it was reliable, it was welded, it had a proper 3-man turret with crew tasks divided up, it had excellent suspension, lots of room inside, and had working radios. Now, the vehicle was not flawless. Heavy maintenance would still be a chore, and the 37mm required either a lucky shot or Panzergranate 40 at close range to deal with a French tank. But those flaws were nowhere near enough to counter the capabilities of a tank which could be counted on to show up where you needed it, when you needed it, and was a threat to pretty much everything that it was likely to meet. Plus, if you were usually mobile enough and flexible enough, you could be where the French tanks weren't. The only problem, there weren't enough of them. In fact, there were barely 350. In comparison to the other tanks, though, they generally had an effect far beyond their raw numbers. To fill in the gap, fortunately, they had over 300 of the Czech Panzer IIIs. In early 1940, these were redesignated as the Panzer 35T and the Panzer 38T, by names by which we are now more familiar, but they were still fielded on the Panzer III basis of issue to the light tank companies. As a tank, they are not equal to the Panzer III, with a riveted construction and a two-man turret. And even at that, the vehicles were designed as actually one-man turret vehicles. The Germans, some consider that unacceptable, so somehow they managed to shoehorn a loader into it. On the other hand, the 37, as found on the 38T, was actually a touch more of a threat to French tanks. It was more powerful armor piercing. And the vehicle, with its British design gearbox, was very easy to drive, had reasonable suspension, and was certainly an improvement over the Panzer IIs that were being used to fill in the other gaps of the Panzer III issue. Somewhere over 100 of the vehicles were the older 35T, leaving about 200 of the newer 38s. The vehicles were designed to resist 20mm fire, and only the front hulls of some of the vehicles had been up-armoured by the time May of 1940 had rolled around. Rounding out the tank fleet, the much underappreciated Panzer IV. Designed as the Begleitwagen, an escort vehicle, it was not considered to have the same requirements of speed as the Panzer III, and hence you get the bogie suspension, and it only had a short little 7.5cm gun, mainly designed for infantry support, and not the most accurate thing in the world against a moving target, although certainly a tank would notice if it were hit by one. For a vehicle designed prior to World War II, it had an astonishing amount of upgradability, and outside of some of the earlier models being a little bit light on armor, there is very little negative that can be said about the tank, which filled out one medium company per tank battalion. Somewhere just shy of 300 Panzer IVs partook in the campaign. Fantastic vehicle, which would soon overtake the Panzer III as the best tank the Germans had, and was basically one of the best designs of the war if you consider its time of origin. In terms of self-propelled artillery, there were few options. No resources had been made available to make proper SPGs, although there was the intent to do so. There were 38 of the 15cm heavy infantry guns mounted onto a Panzer I chassis, which is very literally you take a conventional 15cm on a towed mount and you just crane it onto a Panzer I hull. As you can imagine, these were very effective in the assault gun role, if perhaps a little bit top heavy and slow. And they always went around with a half track to carry the ammo and some crewmen. The other assault gun just arriving for its combat debut is the Sturmgeschütz. Not very popular with the Panzer Corps, and it took rather a concerted effort by the artillery and infantry branches to overrule the tankers, who wanted all the production capacity available for their own branch. A total of 24 Stug A's with a whopping 5cm of frontal armour took part in the campaign. But then again, for the Stugs, things only got better from there. Finally, the anti-tank guns, the PACs. And these were designed very much with the French Char B1 in mind, and it was realized that it could be questioned as to whether or not the standard 37mm anti-tank gun could deal effectively with these big monsters. Two solutions were fielded. The first was the 4.7cm PAC T on the Panzer I, later known as the Panzerjäger 1. The 47mm was ordered specifically for the vehicle and mounted on a Panzer 1B chassis with a large shield, somewhat reminiscent of the 15cm infantry gun variant, but for the Panzerjäger, it was actually a purpose-designed mount, not just a jury-rigged thing. 18 vehicles were in operation when the invasion kicked off. They were all in a single battalion, but 3 other battalions joined in as they were fielded after a very, very short conversion course. Fortunately, the Panzer I was a known quality, so the hull was fine. And even whilst accepting that the vehicles were basically just bodges thrown together and that a purpose-designed vehicle would be far better, this proved to be a very popular system, and the gunners were very happy to engage French armour at ranges of over 500 meters. The manual for the tactical employment of these vehicles emphasizes their speed advantage over tanks, caused by their light armour, their superior vision, caused by open tops, and their use of mobility to engage enemy tanks by surprise. Doctrine said that they couldn't be engaged in less than company strength barring exceptional circumstances, and that on occasion an entire battalion would be preferable. When the unit that they were attached to would be attacking, they would be kept ready to deal with enemy tank attacks. This is almost word for word what the US decided would become the tank destroyer doctrine the following year. There was one last ace up the German sleeve for dealing with heavy enemy armour, the 8.8 centimeter. 4 anti-tank battalions had a heavy company with these guns. 3 of them were towed, and they were basically conversions of the AA gun modified for ground combat. The 4th had 6 self-propelled 8.8s mounted on 12-ton half-tracks, and this unit had seen service in Poland and then was also used in France. This company was the first heavy company of Panzerjäger Abteilung 8 and was attached to the 1st and 2nd Panzer Divisions. There were other towed 8.8s scattered around in the invasion. They were owned by the Luftwaffe, but in the entire French campaign, these units only claimed 9 enemy tanks destroyed. As a result, the vast majority of the enemy tanks that were destroyed by something other than the 8.8. Regardless of the reputation that the 8.8 had, even that early on in the war. We now move to the French side of the house, and we're going to again start with the personnel carriers. The French had a full-tracked APC, the Lorraine 38L, and just under 200 of these had been built by the fall of France, but they had not yet officially been issued to convert the mech battalions of the French armoured divisions, which were still right up to the outbreak of the war using half-tracks. The vehicles were as a result rather hurriedly and somewhat ad hoc distributed. And I'll come back briefly to the armoured divisions, but remember, go back to my doctrine video, a French armoured division is not what you would consider an armoured division in another country. This is basically a whole bunch of tanks all together and have a single battalion of infantry. The ad hoc distribution is something of an unfortunate truth for the French AFV production as a whole in the lead up to the invasion. And units were receiving the vehicles straight from the production line, occasionally incomplete and without the time available to learn them and learn their quirks and idiosyncrasies and how to use them well and what their strengths were and so on. The 38L was a derivative of the 37L, which is basically a tracked armoured supply vehicle designed to provide logistical support to the tanks, better than the trucks could provide. And similarly, the Renault UE, or the Chenilette, literally the little track, was also more of a tractor for other weapons than a weapon system in itself. For reconnaissance, the Automitrailleuse de Découverte was used, and this is the Panhard 178. It is a purpose-designed 4x4, has a very effective 25mm cannon, and one could expect 40 of them to be found in a division. The DLM and also the DIM providing long-range reconnaissance. Over 350 of them were built, and since it entered service in the mid-1930s, there had been plenty of time for the French to work at the kinks and get used to their vehicles. So arguably, this was the most effective vehicle that the French had as a result. Unfortunately, it was not a line combat vehicle, it's a scout car. Thus, the French could be assured that they will get the information, but the problem was that whether or not they received the information when and where it counted, and then act on it soon enough to count. And, well, as we would find out next week, perhaps you will discover that they didn't. Spoiler alert, I'm sorry if I spoiled the war for you. Also, technically a reconnaissance vehicle, but in reality more of a light tank, the AMRs 33 and 35. The AMR 33 is more or less the contemporary and equivalent to the Panzer I or the Mark IV Light over in the UK. Has a single machine gun in a one-man turret. It's a two-man crew overall. Very light armor, good for small arms only, but it is extremely fast. For what it was, the AMR wouldn't have been bad, but for the fact that it was horribly unreliable. Not much over 100 were in use in 1940. They ended up being in the cavalry divisions, but not the DLMs. For those, they were replaced by AMR 35s, which is a reconfigured vehicle. You put the engine at the back instead of at the front. It's more reliable, and a good number of these were equipped with 13.2mm machine guns instead of the smaller 7.5s. The French had figured out by 1940, though, that the days for these vehicles were also pretty much numbered, and they started being replaced by heavier vehicles, at least in the DLMs, the mechanized cavalry divisions. But about 150 or so of the AMR 35s could still be found in the DLMs, whilst others were sent to other units. The vehicle replacing them in the DLM was the Hotchkiss H-35. Now, it may be a little bit difficult to comprehend today, but at 28 kilometers an hour, they were considered to be a little bit too fast for the infantry. But more importantly, it wasn't actually all that easy to drive, and it was a bit on the expensive side. The DLMs, though, at this point should perhaps be mentioned that they're about as close to a panzer division as you would find outside of Germany. They're very powerful units. And the higher speed of the Hotchkiss appealed to the cavalry corps and its need for rapidly moving units which could screen the infantry units, the mechanized or motorized infantry units that were going into Belgium. Again, I refer you to the French Doctrine video. The upgraded or faster version, commonly known as the H-39, with almost double the horsepower, 120, that topped out at 38 kilometers an hour. Now, curiously enough, the way things worked out, the infantry turned out to be a major user of the H-39 after all, and they teamed it with the Char B-1s in the armored divisions. Although some of the H-39s did actually filter through to the cavalry as well. The H-35 was not the worst vehicle in the French military, and that is sayable because there is such a low bar set. It's a two-man tank, and the 4 centimeters of armor was probably its best feature. The gun certainly is not. It's a short little 37mm SA-18 of World War I vintage, and it lobbed such puny rounds that a hand grenade is probably more dangerous. There was an upgrade program started in early 1940 to increase the gun to the SA-38, higher velocity. The HE rounds weren't very much better, and you got about 100 meters per second gain of velocity, which means that the SA-38 is a threat to Panzer IIIs and IVs at close range. The problem, very few SA-38s were actually fielded, and the turret is absolutely horrendous. It's the same turret as found on the Renaults, and as I said, there are one-man turrets and there are one-man turrets. It is cramped with the main gun, let alone the bigger, later gun with the bigger ammo, and the vision is absolutely horrendous. Platoon leaders usually had a radio, other tanks in the platoon usually did not. And in these things, it is difficult enough just figuring out where you were and where your buddies were, let alone finding and engaging the enemy. And this was a problem common to pretty much all French tanks. There was a two-man tank, the ACG, but very few of them were built. They were actually built for the Belgian army, and there was a couple that were in France, and they nicked them and they put them into service. The last armored vehicle to make note of for the cavalry is the S-35, and this one I have also done a video tour of over on my channel. And it is the only tank where auto-mitrailleuse de combat, only the infantry are allowed to have tanks, that I would consider even vaguely worthy of being called viable. And even at that, it's somewhat iffy. We have a 3-man crew, which, as usual, one is in the turret and can basically see nothing. He is the commander and the gunner. He may be assisted by the radio man, because since most S-35s didn't actually have a radio, he had absolutely nothing better to do than to kind of squeeze in underneath the 1.5-man turret and load the gun. The gun itself is excellent, the 47. but it is kind of pointless if you can't find the targets to aim it at. Going from head out to see out, because you got the hatch at the back, and then down to head down in the sight, you're going to take forever simply handing off a target to yourself. The suspension on the tank is okay. It's basically been stolen off of the Skoda 35. Although the front is kind of poorly designed, lacks obstacle crossing capability, and by the time a new design for that was out, the war was over, at least for France. The armor is also pretty reasonable. 4-piece cast hull being sloped, it's 4 centimeters, and the tank will go along at a good 40 kilometers an hour, most acceptable. Unfortunately, being part of the crash armament program just before the war kicked off, a lot of the units simply didn't have time to train on the vehicle, and so could not operate it to its somewhat limited potential. If your tank's running out of gas because you haven't yet learned how to fill the fuel tanks correctly, you have a problem. The absolute worst case was the rather hurriedly created 4th DCR. The tanks were delivered without AP ammunition, sights, radios, and sometimes firing pins. The tank commanders for the 4th DCR were all horse cavalrymen, and the drivers were basically given a crash course in training. Okay, that's your pass, go that away. Back over in infantry land, there were still about 2,800 World War I era FTs rolling around, and about 1,000 of them are unarmed because they took the guns off them and they put them into the other 2-man tanks that were replacing them. It's cheaper. When they were pressed into service, oftentimes it's with a light machine gun, or sometimes even the commander had a submachine gun that he'd just stick through the hole in the front. The other 1,445 or so vehicles are split between line units and internal security or airfield security duties. Not much more need be said about the FT. In common with the other 2-man tanks, these were considered to be more or less self-propelled armored artillery, more than tanks that we know today, fairly much in the World War I molds, and speed was not an issue. Armor, however, was an issue, and the FT didn't really have any worthy of the name by the 1930s. And so a search was put on for the replacement. The first attempt is the D1. And this is a fairly odd one in the overall French scheme of things. Basically, this is a super FT by way of the NC series, and the lineage is particularly obvious if you look at the earliest vehicles that were still delivered with FT turrets. Now we've got 3 centimeters of armor and 18 kilometers an hour speed, and a very reasonable 47mm gun. Not only that, but every tank had a radio and a radio operator. The radio was terrible, but it was better than nothing. Or at least it would have been had the D1 unit actually been allowed to use its radios. They were ordered not to, because they were A, worried that the Germans would be eavesdropping, and B, worried that the Germans would be placing false orders on their frequency. So, like on the S-35, the radio man can also play ersatz loader, which is a little bit more difficult in the D1 because the turret isn't as big as that on the S-35. And inside, the commander is every bit as blind. The D1s are a little bit irrelevant anyway, and they started the war in North Africa. And by the time that they got shipped back to metropolitan France, it was basically mid to late June, and well, the cause was lost anyway. This brings us to the D2, which was developed as a char de bataille, basically a battle tank. Not an infantry tank in the same way as the FT was, and there was some thought going around at the time as to possible other uses of the tank, and again I'll refer you to the doctrine video. There already was a char de bataille under design in the mid-1920s, but there was the possibility that it would become banned in arms reduction talks, and something lighter was required as a backup. So compared to the D1, the D2 added an extra centimeter of armor. The compartment was somewhat rejiggered to put the radio operator up front. It gave it a somewhat more modern look. And better yet, of the 100 D2s built, the majority had been rearmed with the improved 47, the SA-35. It's the same gun found on the Somme S-35. On the downside, we retained the horrible APX turret, made a little bit worse by the height, which means that you kind of had to sort of step onto a stool in order to see out. and then you step off it to see through the gun sight. And a number of the vehicles were caught in mid-upgrade from one gun to the other or conversion to flamethrower tanks. And also, unfortunately, the vehicle was never considered mechanically reliable. More D2s broke down and then were knocked out. There were, of course, the type of tank under the command of Charles de Gaulle, which may perhaps explain some of their effectiveness in the war. But again, relative statement. So in the meantime, Renault has been chewing on the problem a little bit of the two-man infantry support tank, and when the new requirement for the infantry tank was laid out in the early 1930s, it responded with the R35, competing against the H35 and the FCM36. Again, I have a video on the R35, and I struggle to think of a more god-awful piece of crap tank. Now, at least New Zealand had the excuse that they were simply not capable industry-wise of creating a better tank than Bob Simple. The French did not have this excuse. Now, in fairness to the French, for the role that they had in mind, they didn't need a full-up tank. This is more of a self-propelled pillbox to support the infantry. A few tanks did receive an upgrade again to the SA-37 gun, which, again, with the bigger gun and ammo, did not help matters inside the turret. Also, though the armor was officially 4 centimeters thick, Renault hadn't quite mastered the casting process, and in testing, even 25mm could go through more often than not. The vehicle was unbalanced physically, causing excessive wear on the running gear, and had poor cross-country mobility. The eventual fix to this was the R40, of which maybe about 150 of them were built. All told, about 1,300 of the R35 and the R40 were built. Possibly the least worst of the two-man tanks is the FCM36. However, being welded and thus by skilled craftsmen from FCM, the shipbuilders, it was also very expensive and thus not made in big numbers. The interior is far more tolerable than that of the Renault, and the vision is arguably a little bit better, although that is, again, not saying much. The tank even had what today we would consider to be an NBC overpressure system, and though the diesel engine provided good range, you had the problem that it also required a different form of fuel. Also, although the turret was overall a better design, it was incapable of being upgraded from the SA-18 to the more powerful 37, so that was a bit of a non-starter. The French built about 100 of these tanks, and again, I have a video on it. This thus leaves us now with just the big boys. Speaking of, if you're into trains, Union Pacific got their big boy up and running again. The Char 2C was such a monstrosity that even the French figured out it was a losing proposition and they cut the program. It wasn't the end of the Fortress tank concept. They did muck around with a couple of other prototypes, at least designs and mock-ups, but the 10 2Cs built was all that there was, and they were put into a unit of 8. And so we come to the B1, which arguably is the most overrated tank of the war. Now, to put this tank into perspective, when the prototypes were being built in the mid-1920s, specifically they were delivered about 1924, the Panzer I was 10 years away yet. The British had just introduced into service the Medium. This tank is so archaic that it has an honest-to-God engine room. You access it through the doorway at the back of the crew compartment, and there is a passageway through the engine room to the hatch you can get out the back of the tank. If you don't believe me, go check out my video. It's insane. The vehicle got stuck in about 10 years worth of development hell, partially because nobody was sure if the 30-ton tank was going to be legal and not banned by the disarmament conferences, and then because it entered very low rate production. Worse, this was a tank developed without a clear purpose in mind. It was more of a pet project of STM. Now, we certainly had some ideas, like the low gun 75 being designed to shoot through the gun slits and pillboxes and so on. But in terms of doctrine, they hadn't quite figured out what it was for. And despite the long development time, the only deficiencies that were corrected were the armor, to go from the B1 to the B1Bs, and the 47 was improved to the SA-35 from the SA-34. In testing, they realized that the tank was completely blind, but they don't seem to have taken any particular trouble to fix it. Ergonomically, it is absolutely atrocious. The driver's kind of okay, but that's about the end of it. And again, when the tank had a radio, it was absolutely useless. A good line of trees would stop the transmission. Now, the 47mm was good if you could find a target. The 75mm had a pretty hefty bang if the target was obliging enough to stay still for long enough. And the tank is actually not that bad off-road, the ridiculously old-looking track style notwithstanding. And watching it roll around at Tankfest last year, it's actually surprisingly nimble for a bulky old design. And in fairness, the native steering gear is actually quite good, if a little bit quirky. But if you have to have a choice in the Battle of France to be given a company of Matilda 2s or a company of B1s, I can think of almost nothing that the B1 can do better than a Matilda, except maybe lob HE rounds at stationary targets. Plus, like the S-35, these things were being built way too late. Some were delivered incomplete, some without turrets, and the crews didn't really have time to figure out how to use them. Eventually, by doctrine, a role was found in the Division Cuirassée de Reserve, the armoured divisions, but a lack of production capability meant that half of the slots were taken up by H-35s anyway, and the armoured division was really more of a supporting role as part of the methodical battle, not the roles that we would ordinarily think of. There is a bit of a myth that the French threw all their tanks in as penny packets, and this is not true. The armoured divisions were anything but penny packets, and the DLMs, the cavalry divisions, were pretty well organised as well. Now, around this point, somebody is probably furiously typing out, what about Captain Bilotte and his run at Stun? After all, this is evidence that this is a powerful vehicle. Well, there's powerful and there's good. Put it this way, Bilotte started the day as the company commander of 7 tanks. The attack was going to be of 2 companies and the CO, 15 tanks. Of these 15 tanks that set off towards the direction of Stun, for some reason we only hear about Captain Bilotte actually making it to Stun and riding around a little bit. So ask yourself how it came to be, of those 15 tanks, you only hear about the 1 tank, let alone the other 6 that he was supposed to be leading, actually going into Stun. And perhaps you might also ask how many the battalion commander had available the next day. Then ask yourself if the answer to this previous question of why there's only this 1 tank rolling around, is that conducive of a good tank design for winning a war? Was the tank tough? Yeah, sure. Was it any good? Not so much. So now this brings us to the minority partner in the conflict, the UK. And though they were the smallest force, they were also the most modern, and these were the only contingent to start the war completely dependent on petrol and not horses. The British sent 1 armoured car regiment. They had 38 Morris CS9 armoured cars. They were built on a truck chassis, had an open-top turret. They were not very well regarded. They had all of 7mm of armour and carried a Bren light machine gun and a Boy's anti-tank rifle. The Daimler Scout car had just entered service, and a couple of platoons were in France, but these were the very early models and the kinks hadn't yet been worked out. So they were not quite yet the legendary Scout cars that they would become. 7 cavalry regiments each had 28 light tanks Mark VI, making a total of about 200, plus eventually the 1st Armoured Division would land in late May with an additional 125 or so. And as light tanks go, this is one of the best of the bunch, as a 2-man turret and the driver. The design was well developed from previous light tanks, so it was fast, it was pretty reliable, and it usually had a radio. That said, it was still a light tank. It had little armor that was riveted, and it carried a rather unreliable .50 Vickers machine gun. A few vehicles, the Mark 6C, were upgunned to a 15mm and thus quite dangerous to other light armor, but still by 1940 this is not so much of a line combat vehicle. On the other hand, the British did use them fairly intelligently and thus mitigated a lot of their weaknesses. Rounding out the cavalry regiments, each regiment had 44 scout carriers, which is part of the whole Bren or Universal Carrier series of vehicles. And these little guys are some of the most underappreciated vehicles of the war. There's almost 110,000 of the things have been built, making them the most mass-produced armored vehicle ever. You don't build that many vehicles if they are problematic or useless. Now, they had less than half of an inch of armor, and even at that, anybody that they're carrying is only really partially covered, and these are not true APCs as a result. The scout car had a Boyce up front and a Bren on an AA mount at the back, and also they had a radio, 3-man crew. Each infantry battalion had 10 Bren carriers, and it would turn out that in the retreat to Dunkirk, these things were put to sterling use in rearguard actions. They were small, they had the incredibly reliable 85 horsepower Ford V8, which is, for example, more powerful on the 4 centimeter thick Armoured Hotchkiss H35, and it had a unique track warping steering system, which meant that you could do some routine steering on the road without any loss of power. Also part of the British Expeditionary Force at the off, the 1st Army Tank Brigade, which had 2 regiments, 4 RTR kicked off with 50 Matildas and 5 Mark 6s. 7 RTR provided 27 Matildas and 7 Mark 6s. Now, I decree the R35 to being the worst heap of rubbish out there, and this is with a caveat, because I have not yet clambered into a Matilda. However, one must observe a few points in Matilda's favour. Firstly, it has half again as much armour, so these things are pretty tough. Secondly, they didn't try to put anything more than a machine gun into it, which means although it's a one-man turret, at least there's hopefully a little bit more room inside. Observation for the TC is certainly far better. For starters, he can stick his head out up at the top, and even if he does duck down, well, he's got a proper periscope, unlike the stupidity of the steel helmet controlled slit domes that the French had. Thirdly, Matildas came with pretty reasonable radio sets, although it was in the hull, and so the TC had to duck down into the hull to operate it, meaning that the turret is unmanned. The real fame came from the 23 Matilda 2s, which filled out the rest of the 7th RTR. 23 Matilda 2s. That's not really very much to stop an invasion. These things have a ridiculous amount of armor, including the suspension, and it took quite a bit of work to knock one of these things out. And again, I've got a series of videos on this particular tank on my channel. With a 4-man crew, driver, and 3 in the turret, this is a tank that provides a reasonable division of labour, even if the turret's a little bit on the cramped side, and the 2-pounder is an excellent gun for the era, at least anti-tank gun, but it did suffer for not having a HE round issued for the tanks, for whatever good a 40mm HE round actually would have been. A few 3-inch close support types might have been present, but the British idea of close support at the time was to lob smoke rounds. It was very easy to drive, although the early style tracks did leave a little bit to be desired on the traction side, and indeed a few vehicles simply mired and had to be destroyed in place. Further, these earlier vehicles proved to be a little unreliable in the engine, steering and transmission departments, somewhat exacerbated by crews who were brand new to the vehicles and the fact that the BEF didn't bring any tank transporters with them, and so they had to drive themselves around all up and down the length of France from the port down as far south as they went, basically Arras. The remainder of the British Armoured Force is basically the 1st Armoured Division. Recently stood up as a unit, again, go over see the Doctor video. They did show up with some tank transporters, but they also showed up a little late. All told, in addition to the aforementioned Mark 6 lights, the division's 6 regiments between them would have tallied about 24 cruiser A9s, 18 A10s, and 140 A13s. These tanks were, generally speaking, good designs, poorly executed. All 3 of the cruisers are fairly closely related, and I do have a video tour of the A10 up on the channel. The A9 is a daft one of the bunch. With armour not much more than a light tank, about half an inch, this cruiser had the merit of a large 3-man turret with either a 2-pounder or the 3-inch howitzer. It had the rugged, slow-motion suspension, and the AEC engine, 150 horsepower, was considered quite reliable as well. And all told, the tank had a reasonable speed of about 25 miles an hour. On the downside, in addition to the light armour, The genius in charge decided that there needed to be 2 machine gun turrets on the front, one on either side of the driver in the front hull. This makes it a 6-man tank. Coordination of fire is problematic, and let us not bother discussing the shot trap and up-armoring problems. The up-armored tank, the A-10, was up-armored to about 3 centimeters, so it's more or less equal, at least in theory, to the panzers that it would be facing. And indeed there was greater use of sloping of the armor plate. On the other hand, the plate was bolted to an internal structure, thus reducing effectiveness and increasing overall weight. The turret is roomy, well equipped with communications gear, it had a power traverse, and again came with a good 2-pounder gun, or the 3-inch. Unfortunately, the extra weight of the armor dropped the tank's speed to a paltry 16 miles an hour, which rather killed it for the cruiser role. So this brings us to the A-13s, cruisers Mark III and IV. These are, in theory, excellent tanks. Again, we have the large 3-man turret complete with a cupola of sorts for the TC. They are very fast, and they introduced a Christie suspension that the British would use for the rest of the war. At 30 miles an hour, they could in theory outpace a Panzer III, and with a better gun and equivalent armor, they could in theory outshoot a Panzer III. They all have radios, supposedly. First Armoured did suffer some of the same problems that the French were suffering from, with rush production leading to the fielding of incomplete tanks. Some of them didn't have radios, some of them didn't have sights, some didn't have ammunition. Although at least that could be, I guess, traded off. The troubles continued. The armour on the Mark III was again barely half an inch. And that said, though, there was an up-armouring program to bring them more or less up to the same standards as the Mark IV, and you can see photographs of both of them in France. Instead of the rugged AEC engine, they went back to the World War I era Liberty engine, which had over twice the horsepower and about twice or more the unreliability. Also unreliable, the clutch, the steering gear. The tracks, again, lacked traction, and particularly in the wet, they tended also to come apart very frequently at the slightest excuse. Even the tow ropes that they were equipped with were not up to the task. So yet again, we have a case of a tank which just doesn't match up in reality to what the paper specifications say they should. Unfortunately for the British, these tanks would continue to see service in North Africa. On the plus side, the British did have a mobile professional force which understood the need for rapid communications, rapid decision, and they had excellent leadership. But all that would be useless if they happened to be caught out of place. So anyway, that is the armour as it is arrayed between the two sides. May the best, or the luckiest, team win.